All right, hi everybody. We're going to go ahead and do part two now of the 1970s through the 1990s lecture. And we begin here with the familiar presence in the 1980s of Ronald Reagan. Reagan was elected to the presidency in 1980, defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter. Much of what Reagan's appeal hinged around were his unapologetic appeals to patriotism and the greatness of America. There was a perception that Jimmy Carter had somehow scolded the American people, scolded them about their energy habits and their overuse of fossil fuels, and called upon them to do more with less. And by the time Reagan was running for the presidency against Carter in 1980, Reagan had an effective lever to work against Jimmy Carter, this idea that somehow Americans had done something wrong. Typical of the kinds of statements Reagan made in his presidential campaigns and for much of his political life is the one you see here. "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life," wrote Reagan, "but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here." Who was this man, Ronald Reagan? Well, his early life was spent in the Midwest, in Illinois, where he grew up in the town of Dixon, Illinois. He went to college in his home state, where he distinguished himself as a sportscaster, going so far one time as to recreate a football game that had already been played, complete with sound effects and excited announcing. He showed a flair for the dramatic, you might say. Of course, he went on to Hollywood, where he first was drawn to the attention of the American people. In some 53 Hollywood movies over a career in acting, Ronald Reagan became a familiar, if not critically acclaimed, presence on the big screen. Perhaps it's fair to say more of a B-list movie actor than an A-lister. Nevertheless, steady work and a fairly long career in movies. He had been a registered Democrat during the New Deal years of Franklin Roosevelt, but by the late 1940s, as the Cold War began to change the American political landscape, Ronald Reagan was tabbed by conservative Republicans in Congress to give friendly testimony during the HUAC hearings. You'll recall HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, where Congressman Richard Nixon got his first acclaim as an anti-communist. These hearings investigated Hollywood at one point, and Reagan was called as a committee-friendly witness to name names and talk about what he knew of communist influence in Hollywood. And not everyone who was called by the committee was so happy to cooperate, but Reagan was, and he was an effective witness who spoke with seeming conviction, a fact that was not lost on Republican politicos who began to draw Reagan more frequently into political opportunities. Basically, as a speechmaker for the Republicans throughout the Eisenhower years of the 50s, Reagan will finally switch his allegiance to the Republican Party in 1962, and a few years later make his first stab at elected office, running for the California governor's position. He will be elected in 1966. The Republican Party, a conservative law and order candidacy. After narrowly missing the Republican nomination for president in 1976, Gerald Ford would go on to be the nominee. Reagan returned in 1980 to defeat Jimmy Carter in a big election victory, winning 44 states and 50% of the popular vote compared to just 41% for Carter, the incumbent. Carter's presidency had been seriously damaged by the Iranian hostage crisis, and as I said earlier, Reagan was quick to take advantage of what he claimed was Carter's pessimism and defeatist attitude, extolling the virtues of America, not giving in to the Vietnam syndrome in any way, shape, or form, but extolling the virtues of America, patriotic appeals, lots of flags. And though calling for a reduction in national government, part of what defined Reagan's political platform was less government is better government, lower taxes are better taxes. So though calling for a reduction in national government, Reagan stressed a return to patriotism and American military strength, which would require enormous increases in military budgets. In his first inaugural address from 1981, he said, "As we renew ourselves here in our own land, we will be seen as having greater strength throughout the world. We will again be the exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom." As president, he embraces the new moral majority political agenda. These were forces seemingly unleashed by Jimmy Carter, who made no secret of his own religious conversion, his own fundamentalist Christian precepts. Others, particularly in the South, will follow Carter's lead and begin to extol the virtues of religion in politics, and the so-called moral majority begins to mobilize on the backs of evangelical Christians. Among the leaders of this movement, of the moral majority, was the Reverend Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister based in Southern Virginia, who appeared on Sunday morning television shows with his old-time gospel hour television program. Entering politics now not as a candidate, but as an influence, you might say, calling upon evangelical Christians to line up behind the moral majority and its very clear values platform. What kinds of things was the moral majority determined to get into the political debate? Well, not so much the traditional Cold War political issues, but really more traditional kinds of value issues. So, in a basic way, running against the counterculture of the 1960s, and a rejection of the 1960s counterculture by once again promoting traditional family values, what were called traditional family values, a two-parent household. So agitating against divorce and liberal divorce laws. The idea that sex education should begin and end in the home, and so lobbying against sex education in the public schools. Arguing that the Bible countenanced only heterosexual unions, the moral majority was quick to lobby against any liberalizing of the laws with regard to homosexuality. Whether it be something like domestic partner rights for gay and lesbian couples, or even more fundamentally, the ability of homosexuals to teach, for example, in the public schools. The schools, said the moral majority, were a place for prayerful worship, and thus calling upon the public schools to adopt school prayer One of those who spun off Falwell's efforts was Ralph Reed, the head of the so-called Christian Coalition. Reed was a tenacious politico who ceaselessly lobbied members of Congress to vote for the conservative Christian agenda, and perhaps top of the list, because it's easy to sort through these things, obviously against something like pornography, so calling on stricter laws to regulate pornography. But at the top of the moral majority agenda was the repeal of Roe v. Wade, that is, to make abortion once again illegal. Now, Reagan himself wasn't really much of a churchgoer traditionally, but he understood the political groundswell that the moral majority had occasioned and was willing now to make an appeal to these voters on the shared basis of conservative principles. And part of that also was keeping up the drumbeat of anti-communism. It's in the 1980s that the Cold War really begins to unravel. Ironically, it's in a series of arms reduction talks and treaties that Reagan, reaching across literally the table here to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, is able to negotiate some of the more significant U.S.-USSR treaties. Reagan had been a staunch Cold Warrior his whole life, but much like Richard Nixon, who was able to successfully negotiate with the Soviets and the Chinese communists, Ronald Reagan proved quite willing to meet with them and to discuss arms reduction treaties, for example. It was during this period and near the end of his second term that the fall of the Berlin Wall occasions the formal end, if you will, of the Cold War. This most visible symbol of Cold War tensions, the Berlin Wall, will be torn down in 1989, and East Germany, which had been a satellite state, a communist satellite state of the Soviet Union, will be disbanded, essentially, and the process of unification in Germany begun. Likewise, the USSR itself will unravel as a political entity, and its various satellite components will strike out, many of them, on their own now for independence. So quite a dramatic moment in 1989. Ronald Reagan was out of office by that point, but lived to see the end of the East-West freeze known as the Cold War. And yet no sooner did it seem the Cold War was ending than new threats arise in the Middle East. Americans had been subjected to this prospect, of course, in 1979 with the Iranian hostage crisis. And so it's fair to say that the American people had a greater appreciation for the power, the combustible power of the emotions unleashed by fundamentalist Islam in places like Iran. You know, there's a little bit of irony here that at the same time that fundamentalist Christians in the United States are mobilizing politically on their values agenda, that in the Middle East, fundamentalist Muslims are doing essentially the same. Although the difference being is that these Middle Eastern movements were full of anti-imperialism rhetoric, often aimed at the United States. In Lebanon, a group calling itself Hezbollah, or the Army of God, was founded in 1982 as a resistance movement to both Israel and her Western allies, including the United States. And among the shocking tactics embraced by Hezbollah was the tactic of suicide bombing. In fact, it was in a 1983 attack on the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut. The U.S. Marines had been sent by President Reagan to Lebanon to the capital city of Beirut, ostensibly to be a military presence in a war-torn country. But when a truck loaded with explosives drove through the barracks defenses, actually the Marines were residing at the time in a former hotel on the outskirts of Beirut. The suicide bomber drove a truck loaded with explosives right up through the front doors of this hotel slash barracks and detonated his killer explosion, killer combustion in the lobby of what was once a hotel, killing 241 American servicemen. A horrific scene for Americans. The flag-draped coffins, which arrived back in the United States containing the bodies of the Marines, and a solemn ceremony wherein President Reagan and his wife participated in a viewing of those coffins. President Reagan had talked in strong terms about reprisals to anyone who presumed to take Americans hostage or to attack with suicide bombs. We had all this military power in the Middle East, but it seemed unclear as how we would make those proclamations stick. President Reagan said, under no conditions would there be any negotiations with the terrorists, no negotiated release, for example, of Americans taken hostage by terrorists. And this was a point he said over and over again. But then in 1986, Americans learned about an arms for hostages deal that comes to be called the Iran-Contra scandal from 1986 to 87. And in televised hearings, televised Senate hearings, not unlike the Watergate hearings a decade earlier, the country is treated to the twisted tale of the Iran-Contra scandal. At the center of this story was a Marine Corps colonel by the name of Oliver North, who had taken on an assignment in the National Security Agency. His job was to provide funding for the so-called Contras, that is, the anti-communist fighters in the country of Nicaragua, who were attempting to overthrow Nicaragua's communist-backed government, known as the Sandinista government. Now, Congress had specifically prohibited America from providing money to the Contras, for reasons I'll tell you in a minute. But as Oliver North explained, he concocted a plan to make an end run around Congress and provide the Contras with support, though that had been prohibited by the Congress. And the plot line just became more complicated as the hearings proceeded. It turns out that North derived the revenue to provide the Contra with support from an arms for hostages deal involving the Iranians and Hezbollah. There was a close connection between Iran and Hezbollah, and North approached Iran offering to sell anti-tank missiles. Iran was then engaged in a war with its neighbor Iraq. To sell anti-tank missiles, American anti-tank missiles, to Iran in return for their help in releasing American hostages in Lebanon. And that's what happened. North arranged for the sale. Some of the hostages were in fact released, though the public didn't know how or why, only that they were released. This is not to be confused with the earlier Iranian hostage crisis, which had ended in 1980. But a separate series of hostage-taking in Lebanon by Hezbollah. So some of our hostages will be released as a result of North's deal. The revenue from selling those missiles, once again without congressional approval, or oversight, would then be funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua. Quite a scheme. The U.S. used revenue of arms sales to Iran to fund the Contra movement in Nicaragua. Reagan had always claimed that the Contras were the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. The Central American nation of Nicaragua, he liked to point out, was closer to Texas than Texas was to Washington, D.C. In other words, in our backyard. The staunch Cold Warrior that he was, Reagan was determined to see the Sandinista government somehow overthrown by the Contras. Though Congress had prohibited specifically that is, the funding by America of the Contras, after a series of bungled operations, including the CIA placing harbor mines in Nicaragua that ended up blowing up ships belonging to 6 different countries. So Congress put a stop to this, though Reagan made it clear he considered these Contras to be anti-communist heroes, referring to them as the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers, even though many of those associated with the Contras were known drug traffickers. That's right, known drug traffickers responsible for transporting Colombian cocaine to the United States. We add yet another subplot to this story. The importation of Colombian cocaine had begun years earlier, but in its powder form remained relatively expensive and thus out of the reach of perhaps the masses of Americans. Rock stars, movie stars, Wall Street bankers, and such indulged in the use of cocaine at discotheques like Studio 54 in New York City. But by the early 1980s, what was being called crack cocaine, that is, a cocaine derived from a different processing than powder cocaine, involved the cooking of the raw coca into a rock form that could then be smoked, creating not only a more immediate high, but also more cheaply. And it would be the so-called crack cocaine epidemic now that would grab America's attention in the 1980s. But getting back to the point about who was delivering all this cocaine, as it turns out, many of those narcotraficantes, that is, those drug traffickers, were individuals who had close connections with the Contras, the very people we were secretly and illegally supporting in Nicaragua. All this is happening at the same time that President Reagan declares and wages his, quote, war on drugs in the United States. Reagan and his Vice President George Bush will make a determined point of trying to interdict the flow of foreign drugs, including cocaine, into this country by declaring a war on drugs. And that war on drugs would range from the Drug Enforcement Agency down to Nancy Reagan, the president's wife, and her Just Say No campaign in 1984, where she told a group of school children that the best way to fight drugs in their crime-ridden neighborhoods was to just say no. Became a slogan in the drug war. As did well-publicized drug busts, which purported to show the United States was somehow winning this war on drugs. Unknown to the American people, of course, is that among those who were responsible for importing the drugs into the country, particularly crack cocaine, were those who we were illegally and secretly supporting in the Contra effort in Nicaragua. And yet the U.S. government and media announced a cocaine epidemic. That is, once crack cocaine became available on the street more cheaply with a greater and more immediate high, the drug became the popular drug of choice in many of the inner urban areas of the country, which meant that poorer, more often non-white, users of the drug elicited the attention of law enforcement now, which responded in the war on drugs by urging tougher sentences and harsher measures. And it's a series of law and order reforms, like 3 strikes laws, that would produce long sentences for those caught transporting, selling, or even in many cases simply using these drugs. A lot of photo opportunities here of seized shipments of marijuana and cocaine and heroin. Always with the backdrop of Reagan's patriotic law and order appeal. Much hyped stories like the death of Len Bias, an All-America basketball player at the University of Maryland who was chosen number 1 in the first round of the NBA draft in 1986, who died from a cocaine overdose while celebrating his being drafted by the Boston Celtics. So on the cover of a magazine, one of cocaine's victims, Len Bias. That the CIA had maintained relationships with companies and individuals the CIA knew were involved in the drug business was really beyond dispute. Connections between the CIA, Nicaraguan Contras, and cocaine smugglers were shown in an investigative report released by a U.S. Senate committee under Senator John Kerry in 1987. And later in a series of newspaper articles by San Jose Mercury News reporter Gary Webb. Webb wrote a series of investigative pieces tracing the supply of crack cocaine in Los Angeles back through the trafficking network to Colombia that connected those involved in Nicaragua's Contra movement. The headline of one of Webb's pieces was "America's Crack Plague Has Roots in Nicaragua War." At first, Gary Webb was lauded for what seemed a heroic piece of investigative reporting. But almost immediately, the tide started to turn against Webb personally. The Los Angeles Times, perhaps upset at having been scooped by a reporter up north in San Jose on the crack situation in their own backyard. The LA Times called into question Webb's sources. Questions that were quickly seconded, doubts you might say, that were quickly seconded by members of the Bush administration, former members of the Bush administration. These articles were published in '96. Bush was out of office by then. But those who had been involved in the so-called war on drugs earlier now also question Webb sources. Among others, it was claimed that he talked to, well, drug traffickers. Had used drug traffickers as sources for his reporting. Somehow these people were unreliable. Of course, Webb's defense was, if you want to learn about drug trafficking, who better to talk to? And he challenged the CIA to produce its own counter evidence. But in a 1998 self-study, a couple of years later, the CIA reached similar conclusions to Gary Webb. Too late for Webb. Webb had more or less been hounded out of journalism by the slurs and slanders directed at him for reporting what turned out to be the truth, as the CIA itself concluded. So once again, where did that leave America's credibility by the end of the decade? Could Americans believe their government? The famous sex scandal involving President Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky seemed to be just one more brick in the load that was bearing down on America's credibility. Had been bearing down ever since the affairs of the 1960s that we studied. All right, well, that's it for now. We'll take a look at the follow-up in History to Our Doorstep, that in the next lecture.